Two orphaned kids roaming the streets stumbled upon a terrible accident. The older sister quickly jumped in and rescued the guy trapped in the car. After that tragic event, the girl's destiny changed forever. Thanks for clicking on our video. Listen to this story we're excited to share with you, and don't forget to comment below and tell us the name of the country that you come from. The wind whispered through the narrow streets of Houston, dragging stray papers that danced beneath the dim glow of the streetlights. Haley, barely 15, carried her brother Jason, a 2-year-old, in her arms, sleeping with the peace of someone who doesn't know the world's burdens. Her dark hair, tousled by the night breeze, framed a face etched with exhaustion and determination. Her pace was brisk, almost hurried, as her eyes scanned every corner, searching for a safe place to shelter. "Just a little further, Jason," she murmured, though the child couldn't hear her, lost in his dreams. Haley's voice, firm but soft, was the only sound that broke the silence of the early morning. Suddenly, a metallic roar ripped through the air, followed by the screech of tires skidding on the asphalt. Haley turned her head just in time to see a black car sliding out of control. Her heart leaped as the vehicle crashed violently into a light pole, shaking the street with a bang that seemed to stop time. The impact was brutal, but not final. A second later, a more terrifying sound filled the air, the crackling of flames that began to consume the front of the car. Jason stirred in her arms, restless from the noise. Haley quickly placed him in a protected corner between two brick walls and whispered, "Don't move, okay? Stay here. I'll be right back." Her legs moved before her mind processed what she was doing. The heat of the flames hit her face as she approached the car. Inside, a man lay in the driver's seat, his head resting against the steering wheel, a trickle of blood running down his forehead. Beside him, a woman remained trapped, her body motionless, the seatbelt digging into her chest. Haley tried to open the driver's door, but it was jammed. She looked around in desperation and found a piece of metal, probably part of the wrecked car. She used it to smash the side window until it gave way with a crack. She reached in with her small but firm hands and pulled with all her might on the unconscious man. The skin on her right arm scraped against a sharp edge, leaving a red line that began to bleed, but she didn't stop. "Come on, please," she gasped, her muscles burning with effort. Finally, she managed to pull him out and drag him a few feet away from the car, where the air no longer smelled of gasoline. She gently lowered his body to the ground. The woman was still inside, her head tilted to one side, the flames getting dangerously close. Haley ran back to the car. She yanked on the passenger door with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. She screamed, pounded on the glass, tried to force the lock. Nothing worked. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke was starting to burn her throat. "I can't leave her here," she said, more to herself than to anyone. But then it happened. A louder snap, a dull explosion, and the flames spread violently throughout the vehicle. Haley was thrown backward by the force of the blast, her body hitting the ground with a dull ache in her side. The woman had disappeared behind the veil of fire. Haley staggered to her feet, her vision blurred by tears and smoke. She looked at Jason, who was crying softly from his corner, and then at the man she had managed to save. He was breathing, but barely. Sirens began to fill the air, rapidly approaching. Ambulances and police cars illuminated the street with red and blue lights. Haley stood there, watching as the paramedics loaded the man onto a stretcher. A female paramedic approached her, inspecting the wound on her arm. "Are you okay, sweetie? Anyone else with you?" Haley shook her head. "No, just him." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper. The realization of what had just happened. She had saved one life, but she couldn't save the other. As Jason clung to her neck and the ambulances disappeared into the distance, Haley stared at the empty street and the burning car. The rhythmic beep of the monitor was the only sound that broke the silence of the white room. Richard Sullivan opened his eyes with effort. The fluorescent light hit him like a dagger, forcing him to squint immediately. He tried to move, but pain shot through his body like an electric current. Something in his chest, deeper than the physical wounds, made him stop. A palpable absence crushed his chest. "Where?" he murmured in a broken voice, barely audible. A nurse rushed in, hearing him. "Mr. Sullivan, please don't try to move. You've been unconscious for days," she said, adjusting the tubes connected to his arm. But Richard wasn't listening. His mind was trapped in the memory. The image of the flames devouring the car, the motionless figure of Dorothy trapped in the wreckage. He closed his eyes tightly, as if by doing so he could erase the scene from his memory. But it was useless. "Dorothy," he whispered, and the words shattered in the air like glass falling to the floor. The nurse looked down, uncomfortable. She didn't respond. She knew what had happened, and the weight of that knowledge was too great to express in words. The hours passed like a slow, thick river. Richard remained in bed, motionless, while fragments of his life returned to his mind. He remembered the day he and Dorothy left the doctor's office, their hands intertwined, their eyes shining with joy. "Richard," Dorothy had exclaimed, almost laughing, "after so many years, we can try. We can be parents." The echo of her voice resonated in his mind, so vivid that he could almost touch her. He remembered how she had talked non-stop about names for the baby, about how she would decorate the room, about the walks they would take together. His enthusiasm was contagious, and for the first time in ages, Richard felt like something in his life, beyond his career success, had meaning. But now, that hope had been brutally snatched away. Tears slipped silently down his face, and he didn't bother to stop them. Each tear was a fragment of the future that would never be, of the family that would never be. As the doctors checked his vitals, Richard started to speak with difficulty. "What happened in the accident?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. He needed to hear it. One of the doctors, an older man with a serious face, paused. "You were very lucky, Mr. Sullivan. A young girl risked her life to pull you from the car before it exploded." Richard frowned. His clouded mind tried to remember. An image began to form slowly, a slight figure, dark eyes full of determination. A girl. A girl had saved him. But why? Who was she? What happened to her? He insisted, ignoring the pain it caused him to speak. The doctor hesitated before answering. "She and her brother, they didn't stick around. We don't know who they are, only that they saved your life." Richard closed his eyes. The girl's face remained in his memory, like a beacon in a storm. There was something in her gaze that was impossible to forget. More than gratitude, he felt indebted to her. She had risked her life for a complete stranger, something that he, a man used to measuring every action, could barely comprehend. When he was finally discharged, Richard returned to an empty house. The echo of his footsteps in the hallways resonated with Maria's absence. Everything around him spoke of her. The books on the shelf, the perfume that still lingered in the air, the projects they would never complete together. But amid all that loneliness, something new began to form in his mind. That girl and her brother. Where could they be? How were they living? He remembered the state of their clothes, the thinness in her face, and he realized something. She hadn't just saved his life. She'd probably done it from a situation even more desperate than his own. Richard sat at his desk and started making calls. His network of contacts, powerful and influential, would be his tool to find them. A few days later, his assistant sent him the documents, the camera footage that captured images from that day, and the bravery of little Haley. Silently, he admired the girl's courage. But at the same time, those recordings contained the last images of his wife that day, and his heart felt like it was being cut into 1,000 pieces, witnessing that scene. He closed his laptop and contacted his assistant to arrange a ride to the place where the two children were. The afternoon sun filtered between the dilapidated buildings of a forgotten neighborhood on the outskirts of Houston. The weathered brick walls seemed to absorb the shadows of those who lived there, enveloping them in a cloak of anonymity and desolation. Richard Sullivan got out of the car with a mixture of unease and determination. The neighborhood had a heavy air, with smells that mixed dampness and despair. Richard adjusted his coat, not because of the cold, but because of the feeling that his presence there was an intrusion into a world that didn't belong to him. An older man, his face weathered by time, pointed toward a rundown building when Richard showed him the photo of Haley and Jason, captured from the hospital security cameras. "There, the girl lives with her little brother. They don't have anyone else," the man said, in a tone that seemed to contain both pity and resignation. Richard climbed the rusty stairs with measured steps. Each creak beneath his feet seemed to amplify the silence of the building. Finally, he reached a door that was slightly ajar. Inside, he heard a child's voice and a firm but calm response. "I'm hungry, Haley." Jason's voice was a tired lament. "Just hold on a little longer, Jason. I'll sell something at the market today. I'll get food, I promise," Haley replied, her tone a mix of tenderness and weariness. Richard peeked in cautiously. The room was almost empty, save for a thin mattress on the floor and a box with a few scattered objects. Jason was sitting on the floor, drawing on a piece of cardboard, while Haley, with a scarf tied around her hair, was trying to mend a torn shirt. "Haley," Richard called out, his voice soft but confident. Haley turned immediately, her dark eyes narrowing with suspicion. She stood between Jason and Richard, like a shield. "Who are you?" she asked, firm but with a slight hesitation. Richard took a step forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm Richard Sullivan. You saved me that night, from the accident." Haley stared him down, trying to figure out his angle. Jason, on the other hand, looked at the man with wide-eyed curiosity. "You're the guy whose car burned, right?" the kid asked, eyes wide. Richard nodded, crouching down a bit to be at eye level with the boy. "Yeah, and I'm here to thank you both. If it weren't for you two, I wouldn't be alive." Haley crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "We didn't do anything special. We just did what anyone would have done." "No," Richard said, shaking his head, his eyes serious. "You did something very few would do, and now I want to help you." Haley's gaze hardened. "We don't need help. We're fine." Her tone was sharp, almost defiant. Richard straightened up, sensing the wall she'd put up. His eyes scanned the room, the sparse belongings barely hinting at a life held together by threads. He stopped at Jason, who was looking at him with a mix of innocence and hunger. "I don't think so," he replied calmly. "I know what it's like to lose everything. I know what it's like to need help and not want to accept it. But I didn't come here to force you. I just want to offer you both something better." Haley looked at him, still suspicious, but Jason, with the clarity only a little kid could have, broke the silence. "Will you take us to a place where there's food?" he asked, his little voice full of hope. "Yes, Jason. And also a place where you can sleep without worrying about the cold or hunger," Richard replied, with a gentle smile. Haley sighed. The tension in her shoulders seemed to ease, but only slightly. "Why would you do this? You don't even know us." Richard took a step towards her, not breaking eye contact. "Because you gave me a second chance, and because nobody should have to go through this, especially you two." Jason tugged at his sister's hand. "Haley, let's go with him. I'm tired of being here." Haley looked at the boy, then at Richard, her face hardened by years of responsibility she shouldn't have had. Finally, with a slow movement, she nodded. "Okay, but if this is a trap—" "It's not," Richard interrupted, his voice sincere. "You can trust me." Richard's car took them away from the neighborhood, across the city lights until they reached his home. The contrast couldn't have been more obvious. Richard's mansion was large, full of light and warmth. Jason was instantly amazed, running to the large windows overlooking the garden. Haley, on the other hand, remained near the door, her eyes scanning the place cautiously. "This is your home now, if you want it to be," Richard said. Jason, with a bright smile, responded quickly, "Really?" But Haley said nothing. She just nodded slightly, still distrustful. To her, this place was as foreign as Richard's intentions. But something in his eyes, maybe the sincerity, maybe the sadness she recognized in herself, made her stay. Richard stood in the main hall, watching how the antique furniture reflected the warm lights of the lamps. The quick steps of the servants echoed as they carried out his orders, preparing 2 rooms in the west wing, near his own. He wanted the children to have a quiet but accessible place where they could feel safe. "Have the beds ready before dinner," he said, in a firm but calm tone. "And make sure to leave extra blankets. The winters here can be cold." The head of the staff nodded quickly and disappeared behind the hallway doors. Richard turned to the living room, where Haley was sitting with Jason on her lap. The boy was playing with a piece of bread that one of the servants had offered him, while she looked around suspiciously, as if evaluating every corner for a hidden trap. "Haley," Richard said softly, approaching, "I would like you to join me for dinner. It's a good opportunity to get to know each other better." Haley looked up, her expression as cold as a wall. She nodded without a word, but her body remained tense. Dinner took place in the dining room, a spacious room with a gleaming mahogany table. Richard had ordered a simple menu, something that wouldn't intimidate the children. Jason, sitting in a chair bigger than him, devoured his food with enthusiasm. Richard watched him with a slight smile while trying to break the ice with Haley. "Where are you from?" he asked, careful not to sound intrusive. Haley lowered her eyes to her plate. "From a place that no longer exists for us," she replied coldly. Richard frowned slightly, but didn't push it. He changed the direction of the conversation, asking about the things they liked to do. Jason chimed in enthusiastically, talking about games and dreams, but Haley remained distant, answering only what was necessary. Dinner ended in a heavy silence. Richard, as he got up, said, "Your rooms are ready. Get some rest. And remember, if you need anything, don't hesitate to tell me." Haley took Jason's hand and led him towards the stairs without answering. Richard watched them disappear down the hall, feeling the weight of the wall that Haley had put up. It wasn't distrust of him, he thought, but of a world that had failed her too many times. In the following days, the routine in the mansion changed. Richard, used to being alone, found small moments to approach Haley and Jason, seeking to earn their trust without being pushy. Every morning, he made sure they both had everything they needed. He asked the cooks to prepare simple breakfasts, and he himself would go to the dining room to make sure they ate well. Jason, with his childish curiosity, adapted quickly. Their laughter started echoing through the hallways, especially when Richard showed Jason how to kick a ball in the yard or let him explore the library, always with a patient smile. For the kid, Richard quickly became someone dependable, a warm figure he'd never had. Haley, on the other hand, kept her distance. While she accepted the food and care, her gaze remained cold and calculating, as if she expected Richard's apparent interest to be some kind of trick. Richard wasn't fazed. He didn't force deep conversations, but he was present. One day, while Jason played with a picture book in the living room, Richard sat next to Haley on the couch. "I know this is new for you guys, and probably awkward," he said, his tone calm. "But I want you to know I'm here to help you, not to ask anything in return." Haley didn't respond right away. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the sun bathed the trees in the yard. Finally, she spoke, though her tone remained cautious. "We're not used to someone taking care of us. It's weird and hard to believe." Richard nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off her. "You don't have to trust me right away, but I hope that over time, You can see that my intentions are sincere." That afternoon, as Jason ran toward him with a flower he'd found in the yard, Haley watched from afar. Something in her expression seemed to soften, as if the cracks in the wall she'd built were starting to show. As the days turned into weeks, Richard's small gestures began to have an effect. A shared breakfast, a walk in the yard, a moment in the library where he taught Jason how to read a few simple words. Haley's defenses, though still present, weren't as impenetrable. On nights when Richard closed the doors to his study, he found solace in knowing that, little by little, something was changing. They were learning to trust. One night, when everything had fallen silent. It was past midnight, and while Jason slept soundly in one of the bedrooms on the east wing, Richard was in his study, lit only by the warm glow of a desk lamp. The air smelled of aged wood and a faint hint of freshly poured whiskey. In the center of the desk, a framed photograph rested like an anchor. Dorothy, her serene smile, immortalized in a moment of past happiness, seemed to watch him with a mixture of tenderness and sadness. Richard held the glass with steady hands, but his eyes betrayed an inner turmoil. He took a long sip, and the burning liquor barely managed to bury the pressure he felt in his chest. He leaned back in the leather chair, letting his head fall back. He closed his eyes, but he found no rest. Only fragmented images, the flash of flames, the acrid smell of smoke, and Dorothy's fixed gaze as reality crumbled around her. He opened his eyes quickly, as if by doing so, he could escape those memories. Across the hall, Haley, barefoot, stopped. She had passed the study on her way to the kitchen, but something made her stop. The faint sound of glass clinking on wood, a slight whisper that shouldn't be there. She pushed the door ajar carefully, peeking in just enough to observe. Richard was sitting, leaning over the desk, his shoulders slumped in a posture that didn't match the image of the powerful man she had imagined. His right hand moved slowly to turn the photo frame toward him. Haley couldn't see the face in the picture, but Richard's expression told her everything she needed to know. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was full of pain. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, almost a whisper. Richard looked up, startled. He wasn't expecting company, much less from Haley, the girl who always kept her distance. He didn't answer right away. He simply set the glass down on the desk, the dry sound filling the space between them. "Couldn't sleep," he said finally, though his tone suggested that this was only half true. He rubbed his eyes with his fingers, as if trying to erase something more than tiredness. Haley crossed the threshold cautiously, her steps light on the wooden floor. She looked around the room, the shelves filled with books, the walls decorated with paintings that spoke of a sophisticated but lonely past. Her eyes finally landed on the frame on the desk. "Is that her?" she asked, pointing to the photograph. Richard nodded, his gaze returning to Dorothy's face. "Dorothy, my wife." Haley didn't respond immediately. Her eyes studied Richard, searching for something beyond his serious expression. Finally she spoke, her voice almost inaudible. "You must have loved her a lot." Richard let out a short, bitter laugh. "Loved doesn't begin to describe it. She was everything." His voice cracked slightly at the end, but he regained control quickly. He leaned forward, his fingers caressing the edge of the frame. "We had so many plans, so many dreams." Haley sat on the edge of a nearby chair, her hands clasped in her lap. She didn't know exactly why, but she felt she should stay. "What kind of dreams?" she asked, trying to fill the silence. Richard was slow to respond, as if the words were trapped somewhere deep inside. "We wanted to start a family." His voice was a whisper, laden with melancholy. "For years we tried. And finally, after so long, it seemed like we had made it." He paused, swallowing hard. "The day of the accident, we had just gotten the news that Dorothy could get pregnant." Haley looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. The usual coldness in her expression crumbled, giving way to something softer, more human. "And now?" she murmured, though the answer was already clear. "Now everything's gone," Richard replied, his gaze lost in the photograph. "Dorothy, the future we dreamed of, everything." He took a deep breath, and for a moment, it seemed his body shrank under the weight of those words. "Do you know what it feels like, Hayley? To lose everything before you even have it." Hayley didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind filled with images. Her parents, the night she lost them, the weight of Jason in her arms as she searched for shelter. She didn't need to imagine what Richard felt. She understood it perfectly. She rose slowly and took a step toward the desk. Her hand touched the dark wood, near Richard's, but without quite touching it. "I'm so sorry this happened," she said, with a sincerity that didn't need elaborate words. Richard raised his head, looking her in the eyes. For the first time, he saw something beyond Hayley's defensive facade. A genuine connection, a reflection of his own pain. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was a bridge, a silent promise that neither of them was as alone as they thought. In that long, silent night, as the shadows danced on the walls, Richard and Hayley found a moment of mutual understanding, a step towards something they both desperately needed: healing. The summer sun bathed the gardens of Richard's mansion, turning the lawn into a bright canvas of green hues. Jason ran barefoot, laughing as he chased a ball that rolled erratically across the ground. Richard, standing near a tree, watched with a slight smile. He wore a simple t-shirt and a pair of casual pants, a far cry from the impeccably suited businessman he used to be. "Jason, focus!" Richard called out, raising his hands to show him how to keep his balance while kicking. Jason stopped, his dark hair stuck to his forehead with sweat, and frowned, as if facing a task of great magnitude. "I am focused, Dad," he replied, with a mixture of frustration and pride. Richard felt a knot in his chest. The word Dad came from the boy's mouth as if it had always been there, natural and effortless. He wanted to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he stepped forward and showed him how to position his foot behind the ball. "Like this, Jason. Don't hit it hard, just push it gently, like you're guiding it," he said, his voice lower and more restrained now. Jason mimicked the movement, and the ball rolled more controlled this time. He turned to Richard, his face lit up by a smile that could rival the sun itself. "I did it, Dad. Did you see that?" Richard nodded, feeling a warmth that didn't come from the sun. It wasn't the success of the kick that moved him, but the sound of that word, Dad, echoing in the air like an echo of something he believed lost forever. Inside the house, Hayley watched the scene from an open window. Her arms were crossed, but her relaxed posture showed she wasn't completely closed off to what she saw. Since her arrival, she had maintained a barrier between herself and Richard. It wasn't distrust exactly, but the fear of depending on someone and then losing them, as had happened before. But the recent months had begun to wear down that barrier. A soft knock on the door made her turn around. Richard was there, his shirt slightly rumpled and his hands in his pockets, a posture that didn't quite fit with his usual bearing. "Am I interrupting?" he asked in a quiet tone. Hayley shook her head and moved away from the window. "I was just watching Jason. He seems happy." "He is," Richard replied. He paused before continuing, as if carefully choosing his words. "But you should be too, Hayley. It's not just Jason who deserves a future. You do too." Hayley crossed her arms again, her gaze falling to the floor. "I'm fine here. I can take care of Jason, and that's enough for me." Richard took a step forward, his voice taking on a firmer tone. "Hayley, it's not enough. You're smart, capable. You shouldn't limit yourself to just surviving. You have the opportunity to build something bigger for yourself and for him." The room fell silent for a moment, broken only by the chirping of birds from the garden. Finally, Haley exhaled, as if releasing an invisible weight. What would I have to do? Richard smiled slightly, with a hint of relief in his eyes. I've already looked into some options. There's a program at a school nearby. We can start with that. I'll take care of all the paperwork. Haley nodded slowly. It wasn't a complete yes, but it was a start. The following days passed with a sense of change in the air. Richard helped Haley enroll in the educational program, making sure everything was in order. He accompanied her on the first day, even though she insisted she could go alone. Her pride remained intact, but now it was mixed with a spark of hope. One night, while they were having dinner together at the large table, Jason broke the silence. Haley is going to school like the other kids. Does that mean we're going to stay here forever? Richard looked at Jason, then at Haley. The latter didn't answer immediately, but when she did, her voice was softer than usual. Yes, Jason, we're staying. Jason grinned ear to ear, and without a second thought, leaned in for a hug with Richard. Thanks, Dad. Richard, taken aback by the gesture, gently placed a hand on Jason's head, stroking his hair. He glanced at Haley, who was watching silently, and saw something new in her expression: acceptance. In that moment, Richard understood that he wasn't just helping these kids. They were helping him. They had filled a void he thought impossible to fill. And for the first time in years, he felt that the concept of family wasn't just a lost dream, but a tangible reality. A reality he was willing to protect at all costs. The afternoon breeze rustled softly through the trees in the yard, gently swaying the branches. Golden light filtered through the leaves, casting dancing shadows on the stone ground. It was just another day, but something in the air hinted at a change on the horizon. Inside the house, Haley sat at the desk in the library, surrounded by open books and notebooks filled with notes. As the months rolled by, the quiet of the house had filled with a new energy, a life that was growing and expanding. Haley's face showed concentration, but also something more, a spark that had barely flickered before, but now had taken root in her expression: passion. Often the afternoons melted away between pages of texts on human rights, education, and social justice. There were times when she lost track of time, immersed in words that resonated deeply within her. Richard watched her from the doorway, his presence a silent, attentive one. In his eyes, a glimmer of pride reflected as he saw how Haley, the girl who had arrived at his home, broken and distrustful, was now shaping up to be a young adult with ideals of her own. Haley looked up and, meeting Richard's gaze, smiled, a small but significant gesture. I was thinking that maybe this is the path for me. Helping others. Maybe working at an organization that defends children's rights, she said quietly, as if sharing a fragile thought. Richard didn't say anything, but his presence in the doorway conveyed everything he couldn't express with words. Every day, Haley shed a little more of her layers of distrust, and even though she still felt like an outsider in this world so different from her own, her dreams now had the courage to be voiced. The afternoon continued without words, but with a silent understanding. Soon after, Haley put down her notebook and approached Richard, who was still sitting in his favorite armchair by the fireplace. "Richard," she began, her voice firmer this time, "I want to apply for a scholarship program in social work. I've read about it, and I think it's what I want to do." Richard didn't show surprise, but something in his face changed. The usual thoughtful expression softened. He nodded slowly, as if he had already foreseen this moment. "Whatever you decide, I'll support it." His tone was firm, but gentle. Haley wasn't the only one who had changed. Jason, in his innocence, began to discover his own path. One day, while they were playing together in the yard, Jason dropped the ball, looked at Richard seriously, and, with that confidence only a child can have, blurted out, I want to be a doctor, like the ones who helped me when you fell, you know? I want to help people who are sick." Richard looked at him, surprised, not because the idea was absurd, but because he saw something in Jason's eyes he didn't expect, an unwavering certainty. Jason, with his simple world, had already found his purpose. "I think you'd be great at that," Richard replied, with a genuine smile. That night, as the fire crackled in the living room, Richard leaned back in his favorite armchair. The sound of the wood burning was soft and familiar, but that night there was something different in the air. As he watched the flames, his mind drifted once again to Dorothy. Her portrait was still on his table, but now something had changed in his heart. He picked up the photograph carefully, as if fearing its fragility would betray him, and looked at it one more time. Haley and Jason's words echoed in his mind. He had found something bigger than a simple refuge in them. He had found a reason to keep going. "We did it, Dorothy," he said softly, as if she could hear him, as if his words were a promise made in the warm air emanating from the fire. "Even though it wasn't how we planned it, I found something we never imagined. I found a family." The silence filled the room. It wasn't about simple consolation or resignation. It was a deep acceptance, an acceptance of what was, what he had lost, and what he had gained. Richard had come to understand that his life wasn't just about holding on to memories of what could no longer be, but about building what was still to come. And now, with Haley and Jason, everything had a new meaning. The morning sun gently lit the hallways of the house, casting long shadows on the wooden furniture. The sound of hurried footsteps, the children's laughter, the smells of food coming from the kitchen, all contributed to filling every corner with life. However, today, an air of change floated in the atmosphere, almost imperceptible, but present. Haley was in her room, packing her things. Textbooks on social work were stacked neatly on the table, along with some scattered mementos she had accumulated in the 2 years she had spent at the mansion. A red ribbon, the application papers, a letter she had written to her parents, and some pictures with Jason. All these small objects were witnesses to her transformation, to how far she had come since that first time she stepped into this house. Looking out the window, Haley saw Richard walking toward the garden, with Jason by his side, both standing next to the flowers she had planted months ago. Jason kept yapping away, pointing out the leaves of the plants, while Richard listened silently, occasionally nodding or responding with a thoughtful question. The scene was simple, but for Haley, it was more than that. It was a representation of what her life had become, something full of warmth, love, and support, something she never thought possible. The afternoon slowly drifted by, as if time had paused for a moment. As night fell, dinner was a little quieter than usual. Haley stared at her plate, feeling the unease of an uncertain future, but also the satisfaction of what she had accomplished so far. The clinking of silverware on the plates was the only sound, accompanied by the slight creaking of the wooden floor when Jason broke the silence with a direct question. "Are you coming back?" Jason asked, looking at Haley with innocent eyes. Haley looked at him and smiled, trying to calm the lump in her throat. "Of course, Jason. I'll come back when I can," she said, although her words sounded more like a promise than a certainty. Richard watched silently, observing the dynamic between the two. A soft sigh escaped his lips, not of sadness, but of acceptance. The house that had started as a solitary refuge was now the place that had given Haley the opportunity to find her own path, and Jason, the future he so deserved. But at the same time, he knew that the moment that was approaching wasn't easy for either of them. Haley had grown, and that growth would lead her to fly on her own. The morning of her departure arrived like a soft whisper, but with the force of a hurricane. Haley's suitcase was ready, placed at the entrance. The scholarship contract papers were on the table, awaiting the final signature. Haley was ready to leave the mansion, but the place remained as much a part of her as her own body. Every corner, Every step she had taken in those 2 years had left her with something she couldn't forget. Richard entered the living room where Hayley was standing in front of the door, her suitcase already in hand. Jason was next to her, saying nothing, just watching, as if he wanted to hold on to every detail of that moment. Hayley looked at Richard, and he said nothing. He just extended his arms. The hug was long, silent. Hayley felt Richard's warmth, his solid and reassuring presence, something that was now more than a simple gesture of support. It was the feeling of belonging to something bigger than oneself. "Thank you," Hayley said softly, with her eyes closed, letting the words flow without having to think too much about them. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to believe that I can be something more." Richard didn't respond immediately. He just squeezed a little tighter, as if that moment was the last chance to absorb all that Hayley had meant to him. "We gave you everything we could," he replied, with a calmness that hid the emotion beating inside him. "And I know you'll do great things." Hayley pulled away, but her gaze remained fixed on his, searching for some certainty in the midst of her uncertainty. "Don't worry, Richard. I'll be back. I promise," she said, with a sincere smile. And for the first time in a long time, she believed those words. The door closed softly behind Hayley as Richard watched her car drive away. Her figure slowly faded into the distance, but not from his heart. Although the house was silent again, Richard knew that everything had changed. Hayley had found her place in the world, and Jason, with his innocence, had taken the first step to building his own future. Richard, seeing Jason playing alone in the garden, felt a sense of peace. He was no longer alone in this world. He had found in them what he had been searching for years, a family, not one of blood, but one of the heart. Time flies by quickly. Winter comes and spring returns. An autumn breeze came in through the window, caressing the curtain that moved slowly, like a sigh in the quiet of the morning. Many years passed. Richard watched the garden from the window of his study, his hands resting on the worn wooden table. Through the glass, he saw Hayley and Jason, now adults, each immersed in their own paths, but united by a force that had never disappeared. He watched them interact, and something in his chest tightened, a feeling of peace and pride. He had come to understand that time, although relentless, had healed his deepest wounds. Hayley had grown with a determination that, in her early days, seemed almost impossible. The same girl who arrived at the mansion lost and distrustful was now a woman who led her own support center for orphaned children, giving them the opportunity she herself had longed for. The center was full of children who looked at her with the same hope she had once had, and Hayley was the compass that guided them. Her words had the power to inspire, to change destinies, to fill voids with something that could only be called hope. A few days before, Richard had accompanied her to the center, watching how she interacted with the children, how her presence filled every corner of the room with a warmth that he himself had come to need. The children surrounded her, seeking her advice, her words of encouragement, as if she were a maternal figure, although she wasn't yet a mother. But there was something in her, something that connected, that understood the pain and transformed it into action. Jason, for his part, was no longer the child who clung to his leg in search of comfort. Now, wearing a white coat and a pair of glasses that slipped down his nose, he had become a young doctor, full of passion for helping those who, like himself, had once been invisible to the rest of the world. He started working at a community clinic, where he saw every day how the health of the people who came in depended not only on medicine, but on the care and empathy he could provide. Richard had gone with him several times, watching with pride as Jason calmly explained things to his patients, how he treated them with a dignity the kid never would have imagined in his previous life. He wasn't just healing bodies, he was healing broken hearts too. Somehow, Jason had found his purpose, to bring the same healing he had received, to give hope to those who needed it most. Years went by, and although his body wasn't what it used to be, Richard felt a kind of satisfaction he'd never experienced before. The house, once filled with echoes of pain and loneliness, now vibrated with the energy of two lives he'd helped to turn around. Haley and Jason had become people who were not only changing their own destinies, but influencing the world around them. The summer sun was sinking low, casting a warm golden light over the garden. Richard strolled slowly among the trees that he, Haley, and Jason had planted years ago. Each one had its own story, its own purpose. There was a young oak tree that represented the strength they had cultivated together, an orange tree whose scent filled the air with sweetness, and a jacaranda whose violet blossoms fell like a light rain, creating a soft blanket on the ground. The cane in his hand tapped out a steady rhythm as he walked the gravel paths. His completely white hair gleamed in the sun, and though the years had bent his back slightly, his posture remained firm, his gaze serene. Stopping by the jacaranda, Richard looked up and watched the branches reaching towards the sky. He remembered the day he and Jason dug the hole for its roots while Haley directed them, laughing at their clumsiness. Every corner of the garden was filled with memories. The days when Jason would chase after the ball, tripping on the lawn. The afternoons when Haley would read silently in the shade, a notebook filled with notes and dreams in her lap. And Richard, always there, watching with a mix of amazement and gratitude as those two kids he had once found broken had blossomed into something extraordinary. A faint sound of gravel crunching underfoot startled him from his thoughts. He turned his head and saw Haley and Jason coming down the main path. Haley wore a simple dress, but her posture radiated confidence and security. Jason, with his jacket slung casually over his shoulder, had the relaxed but attentive air that always characterized him. Both were smiling, but in their eyes shone something deeper, an unbreakable connection with the man who had guided them. Richard stood still as they approached, letting the image burn into his memory. When they were close enough, Jason was the first to close the distance, leaning down to hug him with a force that left no doubt about his affection. "We haven't seen you in weeks, and it seems like the garden's grown more than we have," Jason said with an easy smile. Haley joined the hug, wrapping Richard in a warm, silent gesture. There was no need for words at that moment. The action itself said everything that needed to be said. The three of them sat on a wooden bench under the jacaranda, surrounded by the trees and shrubs they had cultivated together. Richard listened as Haley and Jason shared stories from their lives. Haley talked about the new kids she had taken in at her center, how some arrived with looks full of fear, but over time found a safe place where they could grow. Her voice, full of passion, showed how she had transformed the pain of her past into a clear purpose. Jason, for his part, described his experiences at the community clinic, how the patients trusted him, how small gestures could make big differences in fragile lives. His words were simpler, but no less profound. His way of speaking conveyed the same empathy and warmth he had always shown ever since he was a little kid. Richard didn't say much. He just listened, letting their words fill the spaces between the leaves and the sky. But his gaze traveled between them, absorbing every detail, from the way Haley gestured when she spoke to how Jason tilted his head with curiosity as he listened. There was something timeless about that moment, a feeling of fullness that enveloped him completely. As the sun began to dip further below the horizon, painting the sky with oranges and purples, Haley spoke in a softer tone. "Richard," she began, turning towards him, "I can never thank you enough for giving us a chance, for giving us a home, for giving us a family." Richard remained silent for a moment, his eyes welling up with an emotion he didn't need to hide. He looked first at Haley, then at Jason, and finally at the sky streaked with warm colors. "You guys don't know how much you gave me," he finally said, his voice full of sincerity. He didn't need to say more. The words, though simple, contained the full weight of the years they had shared, the pain they had overcome together, and the joy they had built. Silence fell over the garden again, but it wasn't awkward or empty. It was a silence full of meaning, of love, of memories that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. The three of them sat on the bench, watching as the last lights of the day faded and the first stars began to shine in the sky. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the warm air on his face and hearing the soft laughter of Haley and Jason beside him. In his heart, he knew that the family they had built was stronger than anything that time or distance could challenge. And so, under the shade of the jacaranda, in the center of a garden that symbolized their journey together, Richard found what he had always longed for. Not just a house, but a complete family. A love that had been reborn from the ashes of pain, transformed into something eternal. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.